Good morning, guys. Sure do miss you. Miss being with you and hearing about everything that's going on in your life, but we'll get back to that soon enough. In the meantime, I'm going to be reading to you each week in a little video. So my technology sometimes, I need Mrs. Fenimore around to help me, or some of my kids, but we will persevere. So if it's a little bit not great at first, know I'm trying and we're going to get better at this. So today, I've got two books I want to read to you. We're going to start with this one. It's kind of an old school. It's called The Yellow Book of Wordplay Stories. And it's got, I think, 5 stories in it. We're going to read the one that's represented here on the thumb. It's the very last one. And always enjoyed it. Let's get to the... Oh, that's another good one. Okay. It's called Don Pedro and the 3 Dragons. Long ago, many young knights lived in a castle in Spain. An old knight named Don Pedro also lived there. Things were quiet until 3 dragons moved into a cave near the castle. Because they were dragons, they liked to roar and blow fire. They also liked to destroy stone walls with their heavy tails. Before long, things weren't quiet anymore. There they are. And I don't know if you can see it, but on each page they take a new word, and that one is destroy. There you go. The young knights knew what had to be done. Early one morning, they got on their horses and set out to catch the dragons. "Wait for me," shouted Don Pedro. "I'll show those dragons a thing or two." But the young knights refused to let Don Pedro go with them. "This is no job for an old man," said one of them. So there's the picture and the word refused. Fancy horse. "Besides, someone must remain at the castle," said another knight. "There's a lot of work to do around here." The word is remain. Don Pedro was angry. He kicked open the castle door and went inside. The young knights rode off towards the dragon's cave. The knights thought the dragons would still be sleeping, but the dragons were up early too. They saw the knights coming and had time to escape. So I don't know if you can tell, but the knights are coming in the front and the dragons are running out the back. And the word is escape. While the knights looked inside the cave, the dragons ran straight to the castle. They knew it was the last place the knights would look for them. And it says straight. At the castle, Don Pedro was going about his duties. He had already washed the bed sheets and hung them out to dry. There he is working. He's got a checklist right here. Now he's making a pot of soup. Suddenly, he heard a noise outside. He opened the kitchen door. There were the 3 dragons. When they saw the old knight, they all laughed. Don Pedro closed the door quickly. He laughed too. 3 dragons all to myself, he thought. And there they are, laughing at poor Don Pedro. The dragons had already begun. It was the last place the knights would look for them. And it says straight. At the castle, Don Pedro was going about his duties. He had already washed the bed sheets and hung them out to dry. There he is working. He's got a checklist right here. Now he's making a pot of soup. Suddenly, he heard a noise outside. He opened the kitchen door. There were the 3 dragons. When they saw the old knight, they all laughed. Don Pedro closed the door quickly. He laughed too. 3 dragons all to myself, he thought. And there they are, laughing at poor Don Pedro. The dragons had already begun to pound the castle wall with their tails. There was no time for Don Pedro to get his sword and shield. And that word is pound. So he picked up the biggest breadboard and the pot cover in the kitchen and ran outside. By that time, the dragons had made a big hole in the wall. When he saw the hole, Don Pedro shouted, "That does it! Now you dragons are really going to get it." Then he started after them, swinging his breadboard. The dragons laughed out loud. They roared and blew fire into his pot cover. Then they began to skip around the castle. They were sure that Don Pedro was too old and too slow to catch them. But Don Pedro could run faster than the dragons thought he could. Soon he was close enough to strike their tails. He hit them hard with the breadboard. Strike. The dragons stopped skipping and turned around. They weren't laughing anymore. Don Pedro turned around too, and he ran the other way. The dragons ran after him. That was just what Don Pedro wanted them to do. He knew what was around the next corner of the castle. "Can't catch me," he shouted as he turned the corner. The dragons ran faster. When they turned the corner, there was a clothesline full of sheets right in front of them. The dragons were going too fast to stop. They ran into the clothesline and were caught in the sheets. Don Pedro laughed as he watched them try to get free. The dragons pushed and kicked and swung their tails. They turned this way and that way and this way and that way. Soon the dragons had rolled themselves into a ball. That word is guard underneath Don Pedro. Had rolled themselves and the sheets into one great big ball. Quickly, Don Pedro tied the clothesline around them just to make sure they couldn't escape. He used his breadboard to guard them. Finally, the young knights came back to the castle, and were they surprised? There were the 3 dragons tied up in sheets, and there was Don Pedro guarding them with a breadboard. And that word is surprise. Look at the horses' faces. When Don Pedro told the knights about the hole in the wall, they were very angry. They jumped off their horses, pulled out their swords, and cut the sheets away from the dragons. The dragons knew they were in danger. And that word is danger. "Get up and start putting that wall back together," the knights shouted. The dragons knew they had to obey. Late that night, the dragons were still working on the wall. The knights were having a party in the castle. Don Pedro had been given the seat of honor at the dinner table. "Tell us again how you caught the 3 dragons," shouted the young knights. Don Pedro waved